Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Claire Morton, and I am the Community Assistance Manager here at MHP. As always, if you were here with us before, welcome back. And if this is your first time joining us, welcome to session 4 of MHP's web series, More Than Compliance, Multifamily Districts That Work in Your Community. Graciously sponsored by the Bar Foundation, this series is an important part of MHP's Technical Assistance Program for MBTA communities. In previous sessions, we talked about the benefits of complete streets and neighborhoods and what they bring to communities. And we talked about water and wastewater basics for MBTA communities. Today, we'll discuss encouraging family-friendly housing in MBTA districts. Today's speakers are Alexis Smith and Emma Battaglia. Alexis is a principal housing planner at MAPC, where she works with municipalities to expand and diversify housing options and meet local housing needs. She uses financial and build-out analysis to help communities advance their goals through policies that are feasible and implementable. She is a registered architect and has previously worked for a variety of affordable housing developers in design, planning, and development roles. She has a Master of Community Planning degree from UC Berkeley and a Bachelor of Architecture from Carnegie Mellon University. Emma joined MAPC's Housing Division as a Senior Housing and Land Use Planner in September 2021. With an expertise in municipal planning, affordable housing programming, and graphic design, she assists cities and towns in addressing their housing challenges so they can become more inclusive and equitable places. Emma oversees a variety of planning initiatives, including housing production plans, neighborhood vision plans, and zoning updates. She currently manages the Metro Mayor's Housing Task Force. Previously, she worked as a senior planner for the city of Melrose. Emma holds a Master's of Urban Planning from the Harvard Graduate School of Design and a Bachelor of Science in Natural Resources from Cornell University. I'd like to now welcome Emma and Alexis.
Great, thank you so much. And I'm just gonna take one moment to share my screen. Let's see, can you give me a thumbs up if you can see the presentation? Excellent, thank you so much. I feel like we're still asking that question so many years into the Zoom. So thank you all so much for having me and Emma. As Claire mentioned, my name is Alexis Smith. I'm here with the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, the regional planning agency for Greater Boston. And I'm also, a lot of what is informing this conversation is I'm also an architect who has designed affordable housing and family housing for a couple of different developers all over the country. And so I'm bringing some of that into the conversation today. And I've also taken, a couple of informal polls with colleagues to just really get kind of an idea of what's, what people are facing and how to approach family housing, because it's difficult. And, but the last thing we want is to have zoning be an additional one of those difficulties, which it often is. So with that, I'm going to jump right in. I think it's been, if you have questions, you can go ahead and type them in the chat, and we will be keeping track of them. And then we can have question and answer at the end of the session. So again, thanks so much. So welcome. A couple of the things we're going to cover today. Before we start, anytime we talk about family housing, we also need to tie into fair housing, both federal and state regulations. So I'm going to jump into that a bit. We'll talk about what it what family housing even is, or what housing suitable for families is, because that could mean a lot of different things. We'll go into some common barriers, some of which are things that can be addressed through zoning and some of which aren't, but which is just important to know about. And then of course, whatever everyone is interested in is how to comply with Section 3A with regards to family housing, and then also how to really go beyond that and make sure that your zoning is making it as easy as possible to build family housing. So with that, I'm gonna jump right in. So the reason why we're talking about family housing is, in Section 3A, the law stipulates, and if you see me looking over to the side, it's because I have two screens going on. I'm not paying attention. That the housing that is allowed by right has to be without age restrictions and shall be suitable for families with children. So without age restrictions is pretty easy, or self-explanatory. No senior only zoning, but suitable for families with children could mean a lot of different things. And so that's what we're going to get into today. Before that, though, even beyond 3A, even if Section 3A was never passed, this is a really important topic, and I'm glad we're talking about it. I think part of getting 3A zoning passed and adopted is, a lot of the messaging is going to involve a lot more than just, well, it's part of Section 3A and we need to do it. And when family, when you're having that conversation around family zoning, I think a lot of the messaging is just because it's good for our community. Encouraging family housing is a good thing for communities. So just why we're caring about it. First of all, it's the law, which I'm going to get into in a moment, both state and federal law, to not discriminate against families, I should say. And a lot of communities have a lot of housing that's appropriate for families. In many of our communities, most of the housing is single family detached housing, and that is certainly appropriate for many families. But that type of housing is not necessarily appropriate for all families. And so what that means is that when there's kind of only one option available, that there are families who would like to stay or become part of different communities that are unable to if housing options aren't available to them. Thirdly, it's real difficult to make family housing work. And so to the extent that zoning can not be an impediment, that's something that we as planners should be thinking about. And again, it's good for communities to have folks of all ages, families of all types. So again, before we get into talking about what family housing is, we need to get into fair housing. Fair housing, the Federal Fair Housing Act is, I'm going to emphasize that again, a federal act. This is federal law that was first passed in 1968 and has been adjusted and tweaked various times since then. It's actually part of the civil rights legislation, and it came directly out of the civil rights movement. It was passed a couple of days after the death of Martin Luther King Jr. in response to that. And so it's important to realize how critical housing is to equity, fair housing is to equity. Fair housing regulations prohibit discrimination in housing based on a number of different characteristics. The federal characteristics that are race, color, religion, sex, which also includes sexual orientation, national origin, disability, and family status. Family status is the word they use to describe presence of children. And all of these categories are very important, and certainly face discrimination. Today, I'm just going to focus on the familial status, but that's not to minimize the struggles that any of these other categories may face. So housing discrimination can mean a lot of different things. in terms of family housing, a couple of examples are if a landlord just declines to rent an apartment to when he realizes a family has kids. That's a pretty blatant example. Another, or kicking a family out when they have a child or adopt a child into the family. Again, it seems like a no-brainer, but these things happen. And so it's really important to underscore that that is illegal. Another one is requiring families to live in certain areas or steering them towards, certain neighborhoods wherever else. They need to have equal access to all areas of a building or neighborhood or community. Another example might be if a building put up signs that, only 18 and older can access the common area or the pool or whatever. That's, discrimination against children. And again, lastly, so a notice on Craigslist that said, please no families, please no children. All of that is illegal. And Massachusetts has also codified fair housing into its state codes. These Massachusetts fair housing regulations kind of echo and reinforce the federal requirements, and also add several more protected class categories. Veterans, there's several additional protected classes is what they're called, that you cannot discriminate against. But despite this being federal law and state law, there are a lot of existing communities in Massachusetts and all over the country whose zoning in particular does not necessarily align with the intent or the requirements of fair housing law. Here are two examples. I'm not naming the municipalities because I don't want to do any shaming here, but here are two very common examples that you will find in zoning bylaws and ordinances all over the state. Here's, the first one, this is in a cluster development district that simply prohibits units of more than 2 bedrooms. And the second example here says that units with more than 2 bedrooms cannot make up more than 10% of the units in a particular district. That's simply that is very simply illegal, to put it lightly. And I don't want to, and it's fair housing is enforced through legislation and through complaints. So it's, if you have something like this in your zoning, I don't want this to scare you that like someone's going to come after you tomorrow, but you should know this is illegal under fair housing law. And it comes into particular importance because, when we're talking about 3A districts, certainly if your bylaw has any overarching restrictions like this, at the very least, you should make sure that they are not applying to your 3A district. This is a little bit difficult to read, but so there's the blatant fair housing discrimination where somebody says, where a landlord says, I don't want to rent to you because you got kids, or your kids are too noisy, you got to get out of here. There's also more subtle varieties of discrimination. And again, these exist across all protected classes, but I'm going to talk specifically with regards to families. There's been recent case law and HUD has long enforced, and the Supreme Court has recently confirmed that discrimination doesn't have to be obvious or intentional even. A landlord saying we don't accept children is obvious and blatant, and there's kind of no question about it. But there's also, the court has also ruled that if a policy or action or statement has a disproportionately adverse impact on a group of people who is protected by fair housing law, then that also is discriminatory. And so you see a lot of times, different it comes up a lot in terms of only single family zoning allowed in certain parts of town. And if that disproportionately impacts various classes, the big one with regards to family housing is lead exposure. Massachusetts has regulations saying that, landlords must perform lead abatement. On its surface, that is certain that's a great thing. That's not discriminatory, and it doesn't appear to be discriminatory, and it's certainly something that most people would support. But it has ended up causing issues, because what ends up happening is, if a landlord doesn't want to perform abatement, they will simply start using that as a reason to reject families with children. And so that's an area where, a lot of states and a lot of jurisdictions have run up against more of a more subtle version of discrimination, where there is absolutely nothing in the lead abatement law that appears to be discriminatory, or that is even intends to be discriminatory, but it has resulted in discriminatory behavior towards families. And so it's become an issue. And this disparate impact, disproportionately impacting protected classes, is the one that we as planners have to make sure that we're really aware of, because there are a lot of zoning, in addition to the very blatant examples that I gave you previously, with the flat out prohibitions on number of large bedroom units. There's a lot of opportunities for planners to have great intentions, but to end up disproportionately impacting certain classes. So the fair housing in a nutshell to keep in the back of your mind as you are writing your zoning. So moving on, housing suitable for families. 3A requires housing suitable for families, which could mean a whole lot of different things. Section 3A actually gives us a definition. It means that housing comprised of residential dwelling units that are not age-restricted housing, and for which there are no zoning restriction on the number of bedrooms, the size of bedrooms, or the number of occupants. So it's essentially saying you can't prohibit 3 or 4 bedroom units, and you can't age restrict, which is of course a kind of a baseline for family housing. But there's a lot that goes beyond housing suitable for families. And first of all, let's talk about families. A lot of zoning and a lot of policy in general is written. Certainly, a lot of policy that's on the books is written with the stereotypical 1 dad, 1 mom, 2.5 school-age kids, and that's a family. But we all know that that's not what families look like today, or certainly that's not what the majority of families look like today. They absolutely may include families with school-age children. It could also include adults living with their parents, with their elderly parents, and taking care of elderly parents. It could include adults with adult children who have moved home after college. It could include multi-generational families with aunts or uncles or cousins. It could include grandparents taking care of children. There really is no one definition of family, and all of that is important just to remember, because there's no one type of family, which means there's no one type of family housing. And because we have so many diverse family types, we need diverse options for family housing. Again, that is not how a lot of zoning is written. And this certainly harkens back to, many of our zoning bylaws were written in the 50s and 60s, when this two parents, 2 children was kind of held up as the ideal. But that is not that type of housing is not necessarily what families need. So again, zoning, most zoning kind of envisions family housing as this large lot, single family, detached, kind of stereotypical suburban housing. And again, that there's nothing wrong, like that housing meets a lot of families' needs, but it doesn't meet all families' needs. And I forgot to say, and this housing is usually the most expensive housing in a particular town. And that's one of the biggest reasons why it may or may not meet all families' needs. If the average home price of a single family detached house in a town is $1 million, if a family cannot afford $1 million, then they cannot live, then they can't, and there are no other family options, then they're precluded from living in that community. And again, that's where fair housing comes into play. Again, I'm going to say this many times throughout. There's no one type of family, and family housing is not. And there's no one type of family housing. It really all depends on what a particular family needs. If a family has parents who commute and who need to be able to make it home in time to meet their kids after school, or to help their kids with their homework, then proximity to jobs is just as important, is an important component of family housing. If they've got a lot going on and are shuttling kids from here to here to here, and they just don't want to deal with the maintenance associated with a detached house, then having a low maintenance house is an important component of family housing. Accessibility, of course. If any member of the family has particular physical needs, then a single family detached house might not be what they're looking for, and might be problematic for them. A lot of families, even if they don't have extended families living in their particular home, rely on their extended family for childcare, for their social network, and being able to interact with those is all part of what makes family housing family housing. And also, it has a lot more to do with just the building. It's simply having 3 or more bedrooms does not make housing that's great for kids. You want your kids to be able to walk around the neighborhood and play. You want places for them to be able to go play, access to all different amenities, all the things you think about is, having been great about all the things that you loved about your childhood neighborhood are things that kids still want today. Again, because families are diverse, we need diverse family options. So why is it hard to have diverse types of family housing? One of the biggest things is just the market, which is not necessarily something that we can control as planners. When housing is expensive, or when land is expensive, as it is here, it is generally more profitable for developers to build studios and 1 bedrooms than it is for them to build 2 and 3 and 4 bedrooms. And that's just the way the market is, as in an expensive area. But so what that means is that, again, we as planners need to remove all the barriers that we can, so that this, so that this is not one of many barriers. Another market factor is that particularly closer into universities or downtowns, many times families are competing with groups of single folks for homes, and those, if you have 4 single folks who are all bringing in that total to 4 incomes, they're always going to be able to outpay a family that has maybe 2 incomes. And so there's been some, MAPC has done some research on this and its impacts, but it's, it makes things underscores why it's all the more important to make sure that we have as many different options for families as possible. Another huge constraint in suburban and rural towns is infrastructure. Our wastewater is determined based on number of bedrooms, and of course, if we're talking about family housing, you're talking about more bedrooms. I am not an engineer, so I am going to refer everybody to the previous, to two weeks ago's presentation from MHP in this series that talks specifically about wastewater and multifamily. But I want to acknowledge that is a legitimate barrier. There are creative ways around it that folks have approaches that folks have figured out how to take, but it would be disingenuous for me to not acknowledge that this is a barrier. So check out the previous webinar from MHP. And then there's zoning, the one that we actually have control over, to the extent that planners, are guiding zoning. I've just spoke, we've already talked about very common barriers are limits on the number of bedrooms. No 3-bedroom or larger units. Another real common one is age restricted overlays. So having a senior overlay district, and that falls into more of that, disparate impact category. The motivations for that are most likely like we want to care for our seniors and we want to make sure that they have the housing that they need. But what that ends up doing is, it means that it's a lot easier to build multifamily housing for seniors than it is to build multifamily housing for families or for the general population, because there isn't the pathway to do that in the same way that there would be within a senior overlay district. Another one is parking requirements that scale with unit size. This one drives me crazy. It's common for zoning to say to increase the parking requirement with the number of bedrooms. In some cases, quite egregiously so. And it always makes me laugh and not in a funny way when the number of parking spaces that are required for a detached single family dwelling is actually less than what's required for a unit in a multifamily building. Here in this example, a single family house only needs 1 parking space, but a 3-bedroom apartment needs 2 parking spaces. And that's not to say that communities shouldn't think about parking. There are many there are many reasons why families need to have a car, but especially when we're thinking about 3A districts that we know are going to be located near transit. Maybe a family doesn't, you don't need to accommodate 2 cars. Maybe they can, maybe there's 1 car that's needed, and then transit and bike access for the remainder or for others in the family. So again, certainly not, keeping parking requirements to a minimum, or not, or at the very least, not making them more onerous than they are for other types of housing. And the biggest thing is the biggest way that zoning makes things difficult, in my opinion, is not even really any one thing. It's just that I mentioned this previously, that zoning, a lot of it was written 50, 70 years ago, really operates under the assumption that the residences for families are single family homes. And there's not, and there's very few options for, we call missing middle housing, which is, essentially that we've got, I'm sure many of you are familiar with that term. You have single family housing, and then on the other end of the scale, you've got 200 unit multifamily housing, but there's a lot that falls in between there, many of which is of appropriate scale and would make sense character wise with a lot of our small towns, townhouses, duplexes, little cottage clusters, all of that falls under the missing middle umbrella. And many zoning bylaws just don't accommodate that. You're either at single family or you've got huge multifamily. And the last piece is, of course, public perception. There are, one of the biggest hurdles that folks will throw up when they hear about a potential development is school impacts. Schools are a very, very big line item in any municipality's budget. And that's certainly a concern that many people have. Again, MAPC has done some studies that kind of essentially say, that there's not really a correlation between new housing and school enrollment, and that actually what's driving school enrollment is families moving into existing housing. But it's, so there are messages to counter that, but the public perception still is a barrier. So let's get into compliance with Section 3A, what we're all here for. So Section 7 of the guidelines describes how DHCD will determine whether or not a 3A district complies with that piece of the requirement. And it essentially just spells out but it's essentially a repeat of the definition of suitable for families with children. I'm not going to read all of this. You all, I'm certain have read the guidelines many times over, but essentially that distills down to 5 key points. No age restrictions, no restrictions on unit size. So excuse me, that's size in terms of square footage. No restrictions on the number of bedrooms per unit. So no restricting, 3+ bedrooms, no restrictions on the size of bedrooms, and no restrictions on the number of occupants. So if you meet these 5 criteria, then you've met DHCD's criteria for housing suitable for families. That's not to say, that's not to say that if you've met these, you have a compliant district, but with regards to the component of having housing suitable for families. This is all that you need to do. That's really just kind of a baseline. And there's, this zoning could certainly meet these requirements, but simply meeting these requirements would not necessarily result in housing that is, truly a place for families to thrive, or even might not result in family housing at all. Period. And remember, having families in our municipalities is a good thing. This is something we want to encourage. So how can zoning encourage family-friendly housing? Here's where we get into the beyond compliance piece. The first is articulate this as a goal. It's common for, especially in in separate sections of zoning. If you're going to do a cluster development, if you're going to do any specific special kind of residential district, you will articulate the goals and the intent of the zoning. Call that out as part of your 3A district. Communicate that the municipality wants to see housing that is suitable for families. Again, that's not a hard, fast regulation, but making it clear that this is a goal, it transmits to developers that this is something that you want to see, and this is a priority for the town. Location. One of the first things that you'll be thinking about as you're deciding where your 3A district goes is, you'll be deciding, it's the first thing you'll be thinking about within your 3A district is deciding where it goes. For some municipalities, there's not a lot of options. There's really kind of only one choice. Other municipalities, you may have more than one commuter rail station, or even within the allowed radius, there's different places where this district could go. It might be tempting to locate a district on an empty parcel of land that's, a little bit further from the train station, but and maybe between the highways, or close to kind of isolated, because that's vacant land. It's kind of can be developed all in one go. But I would encourage you all to think about connectivity and really having access to services and jobs and to other children, other families, is being a really, really important part of what makes family housing work. When I was having some conversations with colleagues who develop family housing, that was the first thing they said. And I was actually kind of surprised by that, because, architects, they're going to talk about buildings, but most of them went straight for, location as being one of the most critical pieces of having successful family housing. Then moving kind of down in scale from that, pedestrian-centric site planning. Chris talked about this a bit last week as something to pay attention to, and communities can kind of begin to get at this through design guidelines. But really just making sure that the housing that is built is not a building surrounded by parking where there's no place for kids to play, where it's not even really safe for kids to walk, and instead making sure that this is the site of the site design, and then the overall site plan of the district is something that is going to be a place where you'd be comfortable with your kids walking and playing. Kids need to get outside, kids need to run off their energy, and you want family housing to have places for them to do that. I think, this is getting back to the missing middle thing that I spoke about before. But a lot of municipalities, their zoning defines housing as single family, possibly duplex, and multifamily, and that's it. Whereas, Section 3A considers multifamily a building with 3 or more residential units, or 2 buildings on the same lot with more than 1 unit in each building. So that actually allows for a lot of different types of multifamily housing, and multifamily housing at a lot of different scales. Again, you of course still need to meet that 15 units an acre density wise, but this is not this does not mean that that the district will only be these large 200 unit buildings. A town can really proactively plan and encourage smaller housing types where every unit has a door out to a little front yard or has a door out to a common courtyard. But the first step in order to do that is, start defining these building types. Make sure that they're in your use section, and that or that there is a definition in your allowable uses section that covers this. Let's see. And just, this is kind of an aside from 3A, but 3A, you must include multifamily housing by right, but that doesn't mean that you also can't include other types of housing. And so duplexes on their own, on a single lot would not count, but that doesn't mean they can't be an allowable use as well. And so again, just thinking about what makes neighborhoods, complete neighborhoods, it's having this mix is critical to the vibrancy of any area. So getting back to the kind of missing middle and different types of housing, and there being, and getting to multifamily housing as being more than just a huge 5-story over podium, a 200 unit apartment building. Beyond making sure that you have different types of multifamily defined in your allowable uses category, and probably more important is making sure that your dimensional requirements actually enable those types of buildings. For some communities define 3-unit buildings and 4-unit buildings as their own type of use. Some communities define small apartments as their own type of use. But beyond, and you can do that or not, but beyond that, whatever you need to do to make sure that whatever those uses are accommodated through your dimensional requirements. So when you are looking at your dimensional requirements, don't be thinking only of large scale multifamily buildings. And if your setbacks or your yards work real well for large multifamily, or if they were designed for multifamily but wouldn't necessarily work for a townhouse, then maybe you do need to create a new use category. This is particularly true for townhouses and small, or townhouses or little small fourplexes, which are a great kind of multifamily for multifamily for families. They have individual unit entries, direct access to a courtyard or to the open space, and in many cases they're also really consistent with town character and scale of towns. But if a townhouse falls into your multifamily use category, and your multifamily use requires side yard setbacks of 30 feet or front yard setbacks of 30 feet, then it's impossible to build a townhouse within that framework. So give some real thought to, what kind of multifamily do you want to see? There's a lot of different kinds of multifamily uses, and in many towns, setbacks in particular, side yard setbacks, and precludes these from happening. And also allowable distance between buildings on the same lot. In many communities, the allowable distance between buildings on the same lot might be 50, 100 feet, which may make sense on a huge 20-acre parcel. But if you have a smaller parcel where you just want to put two or three little duplexes, then that then that doesn't work. Those requirements don't work. If you want to do cottage clusters, which again, small pocket neighborhoods or cottage clusters wouldn't, it's single family, it wouldn't meet the multifamily by right requirement, but it could certainly be an allowable use and is a great option for family housing. So just giving some thought to what kind of multifamily housing you want to see, and then making sure that your dimensional regulations can allow that to happen. Be cognizant of predominant lot sizes in your 3A district also. That kind of gets back to what dimensional restrictions are allowed. And this has to do with family housing. It also has to do with 3A compliance in general. If most of your lots are 1 to 2 acres, then your setbacks and lot coverage and dimensional requirements are going to be very different than if most of your lots in your 3A district are 2,000 feet, 20-foot wide lots. And I'm not talking about allowable lot size, although you should set an allowable lot size that is consistent with historic lot patterns. But I'm talking about what actually exists there. And depending on, if you've got all small lots, if all your lots are 30 feet wide, and then you've got a required 10-yard side foot or 10-foot side yard setback, then that, again, just precludes townhouses or whatever type of development you might be looking for that might actually be a really good fit for your community. Balancing lot coverage requirements and height requirements. Again, this is not necessarily specific to family housing, but it's 3A in general. If you want to, if you need to hit this 15 unit an acre threshold, a municipality is going to have to probably give a little flexibility on either lot coverage or height. And so thinking about, which you can't have only 25% lot coverage and only 2-story maximum allowable height and meet this 15 unit an acre threshold. So think about how do you want to adjust that, and what does that mean in terms of housing suitable for families? Again, townhouses are such a great option for families. They're dense, but they also allow private open space in the rear yard, private entries, and they have very high lot coverage ratios. So if this is something that your town wants to encourage and allow as multifamily, then maybe lot coverage is where you want to offer some flexibility. Open space requirements are real tricky. If open space is such an important part of housing, especially, again, knowing that families comprise all different ages, but especially kids. I have nieces and nephews who are ages 4 and 5 and 6, and my gosh, I need to let them out to run them and get their energy out. And in multifamily housing, if you don't have a private backyard, having communal access to that yard is really important. Being able to have the unit open or unit door open directly onto that is even better. So open space is critical. But in a lot of municipalities, open space requirements, which can be very difficult to understand when you're reading the zoning, end up really precluding or effectively prohibiting multifamily development of any scale, because it has to be, certain minimum size. If you're building height, then all of a sudden half your footprint ends up having to be open space. So I would say, think about what if the community feels an open space requirement is important, then think about creative ways that can be met on rooftop patios, and you can stipulate that it's not just the roof with a rail, but well-designed rooftop patios, well-designed common areas, taking care common open space as an actual usable place. And I would think the biggest thing there is just to be flexible. You can require open space, but if it's too stringent and there's no way for a developer to get around it, then that just really removes a lot of the options they have to making well-designed housing that really responds to family needs. Same thing goes for parking. If your community feels that parking requirements are, you have to have parking requirements, then that that's, you know, if that's your community's goal, but scaling, make sure that they're reasonable for a district that is located within a half mile from a transit stop, and that it's not, and that you're not actually asking for more parking out of multifamily housing than you are out of single family housing. A structured parking space costs, you know, upwards of $30,000 a pop. You know, if there's no sense building that if you don't need it. And then finally, just don't forget that, you know, not everyone wants to live in a large detached house. A lot of people approach zoning thinking through a lens of like, you know, it would be almost cruel to build family housing that is not single family housing, because how could I ask a family to live there? But families have different needs, and there are options, you know, there are multifamily options that would work for a lot of families where kids can thrive. And so I think, you know, don't try to remove that tunnel vision, and just remember that there's a lot of different places where a lot of different ways that family housing can really respond to the needs of, or the different types of housing can respond to the needs of families. And so that's all that I've got. I think I'm gonna turn it over to Emma for questions at this point, or items to share. I would love to hear, you know, how you all are approaching zoning, you know, encouraging family housing through zoning as well.
Great. Well, we've got a number of good questions here, and feel free to keep them coming in the chat as we start going through these. The first question asks about what to do if you are limited to number of bedrooms due to Title V issues.
That's the best question. And I appreciate that you called me out for skirting that in my presentation. I think I will say again, I am not an expert on Title V, and so on a high level, I'm going to defer to what I don't remember his name, but the fellow who spoke 2 weeks ago, who is an engineer, who is an expert on Title V. I would encourage you to watch that video. But beyond that, I mean, there's the number of bedrooms kind of, it's almost, I don't want to say subjective, but, you know, number of bedrooms on a particular lot, you know, lot size can be, you know, you could have the same number of bedrooms on a 1 acre lot as you could have on a half acre lot, as you could have on a quarter acre lot. And, you know, there's ways to approach that, the number of bedrooms, you know, by dealing with, excuse me, I just lost my train of thought here. By dealing with, you know, with, you know, you can use septic systems up to a certain size. As you know, there's ways to creatively deal with that if you are not using you know, if there's if you're too many bedrooms for a septic system. There are a couple examples I can think of where, you know, some of the images I showed of lovely cottages arranged around a courtyard, where that central courtyard is actually serving the leaching function. So those leach fields are being used, those become the amenity, and it's the communal leach field that becomes the amenity and open space for the development. And, you know, that can work up to a certain size. Beyond that, you know, you all know better, if you all are town planners, you know better than anyone that, you know, beyond that, you're looking at package treatment plants. And maybe this is where town planners need to get a little bit creative, and facilitate a package treatment plant that is, you know, that's serving multiple different small buildings, either, you know, through infrastructure grants or whatever else the case may be. I would say it makes it difficult, but not impossible. And for more of the details, I am going to refer you to the session from 2 weeks ago, who has the engineer who's actually the expert on Title V.
Great. And I think another thing that's important to add is that we're not necessarily recommending the creation of all, you know, 3-bedroom plus developments. It's more thinking about a mix of unit sizes, and, you know, how do we create communities and neighborhoods that are really good for families, but are really good for everybody else, kind of like this universal design principle, I guess. Okay, so another question we have, are there any issues with federal law if there is a limit of a maximum of 2 bedrooms in an accessory dwelling unit bylaw? That's kind of a very specific.
It is a very specific
example.
question. I don't believe so. With the caveat that I am not a fair housing attorney, but that is, ADUs are by nature, accessory dwelling units are by nature very small. And they are, usually accessory to a larger house with however many bedrooms. So I do not believe that would run afoul of fair federal fair or state fair housing law.
Great. Does family include people who are not related by birth or marriage?
That depends on how you define it. I think it's typically defined in typically family is often defined in your zoning bylaw. And typically it means, and typically it is limited to those who are related by blood or marriage. But it doesn't have to be that way.
If someone adopts.
Adopt count the same way. Yes. That is I won't say most. Many municipalities do have occupancy limits on the number of non-family members who can live together. And again, that would either be in your bylaw or not. But I would say, because that's a often piece of the zoning bylaw, that's something that you can change.
Mm-hmm. What if developers propose just 1 bedroom or 2 1 bedroom or studio units? Can the town require 2 or more bedrooms?
That's a tricky one. I would not recommend that a town write into its zoning a however many bedroom requirement, just because the more requirements that you put in, the more difficult it is to respond to market conditions and have a development program that actually responds to what the town needs and what the market is asking for. I would strongly encourage. I think that's where the putting it out there as part of your goals at the outset, and just making it very clear that this is something that you're looking for. I think incentivizing rather than requiring large bedroom units would be the way to go. Because if you offer I know it's so difficult to talk about like a density or height bonus when for many municipalities this 15 units an acre is already a lot more density than exists. But I would think about incentivizing three or more bedroom units. Maybe it means maybe there's something that could be offered in terms of permitting or whatever else. But I would approach that through incentives and encourage it through incentives.
Mm-hmm. And then the opposite of that.
I was going to say, Emma, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I mean, I think that's a good thing. I mean, I think part of it is the parking piece. So I think that's a big incentive in and of itself, not requiring more spaces for, the number of bedrooms. And then, yes, so then the flip side of that, we have a huge need for studio and 1 bedroom units in our town. That is what is more affordable, not a 3 bedroom unit, especially where the statute only allows for 20% affordable.
I mean, I think ultimately the tricky thing when we're talking about zoning is whatever we write in our zoning bylaws, the developer is going to build what there is a market for. And if in a particular community, there's the need in the market for 1 bedrooms and studios, then that's what developers will build. I would just say, I would, hope that beyond the 5 kind of like checklist things, which are honestly just kind of things you have to do anyways to comply with fair housing regulation, that it wouldn't preclude 3 bedroom units should that become something that is a need, in the future. Zoning we all have zoning in our municipalities that has been on the books for 50 years and that hasn't quite gotten around to being changed. So building in that building in that flexibility and knowing that what your town needs now might not be what your town needs in another 20 years. And then again, it's just knowing what your town's needs are. In many places, there's a need for more than one thing, like one bedroom. There's a strong need in many communities where multifamily isn't even allowed. Like, yeah, 1 and 2 bedrooms and multifamily units are where the most need is. But in many of those communities, there also may be a need for more affordable, smaller, family-sized units, because if all that exists in a community is single-family $1 million houses, then yes, there's a need for 1 bedrooms, but there's also a need for family housing that doesn't cost $1 million. So I would, at least be open to it, but there's nothing that's going to force the developer to build 3-bedroom units.
Right. So someone sort of is bringing in the kind of asks how we zone for, relatively affordable housing for non-wealthy families, specifically with at least two kids and maybe an adult working from home, because the targets, limit setting, because we can't set targets for, unit size. And it seems like both studio apartments and luxury units count as much as, a modestly sized, like in between unit that might be like around 1,000 square feet and 3 bedrooms, which the market isn't building. So how to kind of creatively zone for those things?
Oh, geez. That's $1 million question. I've worked with municipalities on, cottages where the actual units, where the unit size is limited. That obviously wouldn't work here because that is a baseline requirement that you cannot limit unit size. But how to encourage housing that isn't the luxury housing is really hard. I think that's where it's setting goals. That's where incentivizing. I think using tools like 40R can be really effective. I should have brought up 40R previously, but using state programs and state tools that do exist, that do incentivize certain types of housing, would certainly be an avenue to do that. And then also, one thing, this is, a lot of it's going to come down to your height and lot coverage and dimensional regulations as well. Developers are going to typically maximize the number of units that they, unless zoning is so out of whack with the market and in terms of what it will allow. Thinking about how your height restrictions and your lot coverage and FAR and setbacks interact. Like I would model that out, figure out what that actually looks like, because in a lot of cases it does not look like what you are expecting or what you want it to look like. There's ways that all of those interact, weirdly, that just kind of, if they all mesh in too complicated ways, and then single family or whatever becomes the only thing you can build, then that then that's not what anyone wants. So I would take the time to model out what it looks like on lots of a couple different sizes and shapes and see what that lends itself to.
Great. Well, that looks like the last question. We have a couple, comments in the chat, a little bit of a nice dialogue.
Oh, great.
Back and forth. So if anyone wants to read through that, feel free. I would say if anyone has any other questions, now would be the time to ask them. Otherwise, we might be able to let you go a little bit early. Christine is raising her hand. Would you like to speak, Christine?
Sure. I thought it would take longer for me to type it out. So I figured I just unmute myself. Thanks.
Everyone knows who you are anyway.
Christine Woodall from MHP. So my question about how to define a family, there was an earlier question from the audience about whether people who are unrelated by marriage or birth are considered family. would you say, Alexis or Emma, that as long as the zoning does not define the family, then it wouldn't violate any federal law? I think it's the fact that, as the examples you have shown earlier, that they explicitly define what a family is or explicitly prohibit certain number of bedrooms, that kind of triggers the kind of violation with fair housing. Is that correct? So as long as they're silent about how a family is defined within their zoning ordinances and bylaws, then they should be okay. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's the safest thing to do. And I didn't get into this, but sometimes where those occupancy restrictions come into play, and this is not to do with 3A, this is more fair housing, but some municipalities will have regulations that not more than, 4 unrelated people can live in the same house, and that can run afoul of protected disability as a protected class, because it precludes group homes. That is not something to do with 3A, but in general, when you're talking about fair housing, just kind of staying silent on the defining what a family is the safest thing to do. And also just like families are only getting more hodgepodge, and for many people that's a good thing. So
and from like an equity standpoint, we know that there are a lot of people from different families living together in the same units, and so we don't want to make that more difficult.
Yeah.
So someone's asking you to address the question about ADUs regarding the 2-bedroom limit, which I know you tried to answer. I mean, I think the reason why that doesn't run afoul of fair housing is because it's such a limited size, and you're very much thinking about what is like enough habitable space. So, when you're only talking about like a maximum of 1,000 square feet, I think requiring or, allowing more than 2 bedrooms is kind of getting into a gray area there. Do you want to do anything to add to that?
Yeah, and ADUs are also kind of a bonus. Like,
yeah,
they are the baseline of what's allowed is typically a single family detached home, and ADUs are a bonus on top of that. If you said that all single family detached homes in a district can only be 2 bedrooms, that would be
the issue.
But when the ADUs are just kind of like a bonus that on one, on a lot by lot basis, again, because then that's excuse me, then that's it's a district level versus.
Yeah. Any other questions? Catherine, Lacey. You'll just need to unmute.
Sorry, I'm still muted. I'm with MHP. I'm home with COVID, so I'm not presenting.
Oh, better.
It's okay. I did want to just follow up on the bedroom, the Title V requirement.
Oh, good.
That is it. Alexis got it. I mean, it's the Title V requirements still hold. They're depending on the type of system you're using. The total number of bedrooms is for the site, not for the unit. So if it would, it just has to average out to be however many bedrooms Title V allows. I think what Joe Pesnola talked about is that there are, alternative systems that are being developed, et cetera. But basically, Title V does hold.
Great. Okay, well, that seems to be all the
I
questions.
will say, but that, if Title V, if by Title V you are allowed 4 bedrooms, that certainly wouldn't preclude, this is getting away from the family housing thing, but that wouldn't preclude a multifamily building each with 4 1-bedroom units. There's ways within Title V that you can accommodate smaller missing middle housing types.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Katie.
I think that's it.
Great, thank you. You can unshare your screen, Emma. that would be helpful. Thank you. All righty. Thank you both, Emma and Alexis, for your presentation today. It's always great to have you all from MAPC giving us some of your knowledge. As always, these recordings will be available on our website, and we'll send out some kind of notification when they are available. So you all spoke, we listened. We're taking a quick break from the regularly scheduled program to focus on helping MBTA communities get started on taking steps to comply with the new law. Our next week's session will be hosted by experts from MHP and DHCD. And this webinar will provide guidance on action plans, how to use the online tools to help visualize districts, and technical assistance available to MBTA communities. With that said, join us next week, same place, same time, for this new session, Getting Started for MBTA Communities. And also, there are a bunch of links in the chat. They're useful links, so if you have some time, check them out. And you'll find my contact information along with Emma's and Katie's if you have any questions. It's always great to give you all some more time back to your day. So have a wonderful day, and we'll see you all next week for this new session.
Thanks.